So when you enter a neurodiverse relationship and then on to the neurodiverse marriage, it's a lot like a boxing match and getting in the boxing ring. Some people play by a different set of rules. They may butt heads, they may knee you in the groin, they may step on your foot. So some people are going to abide by the standard boxing rules and some are not. They might hit below the belt, they might push you into the ropes, all kinds of things. And you have to know that this is just human nature. It's not just the experience that you're having in a neurodiverse marriage. If you think broadly, you run into people who don't play by the rules in general. If you're walking down the street and you trip over a rock, you don't get angry at the rock. So people are a lot like rocks that get in your way. They are, in a sense, obstacles from time to time for you. They have their own nature, and that nature isn't yours, and it's going to clash with you sometimes, and that's just what it means to be a human in general, but you may experience this to a larger degree in the neurodiverse marriage. So are you going to complain that people have a nature where they have an ego, or they can be passive-aggressive, or they cannot play by the rules, or they have weak moments and, quote, misbehave, unquote? And then in your constant complaining, you put yourself in a chronic disadvantage because you're draining yourself of a lot of energy that could be better used for other things. You're draining yourself with all these useless negative emotions, and you're not playing proper defense against your opponent, if we want to run with this boxing analogy, because you're all consumed with this kind of personalizing the situation, that this person shouldn't be doing these things, they shouldn't be hitting me, they shouldn't be getting in my way, they shouldn't be trying to defend themselves, they shouldn't be engaged in self-preservation, they shouldn't have their own fears and worries and anxieties. So instead you have to create some distance between you and your opponent. And you have to do that in a very smart and intelligent way. That's called healthy emotional detachment. Not just your neurodiverse marriage, but other people in general. They're going to play a little dirty from time to time, and they're going to hit you, and it's going to hurt. But you don't whine and complain. You just figure out how you're going to defend yourself better. And one of the ways you defend yourself is not necessarily to hit back, but not make yourself vulnerable by putting yourself in harm's way time and time again. Or having very mature and convincing arguments that influence the other person to perhaps change their behavior. Forgiveness is letting go of resentment. Resentment is simply replaying the past events in your head. Rewatching the movies. We're using his NT wife as the example. She goes back in time and replays the movies. That is resentment. She has a lot of memories, and she goes back and revisits those memories. And when she goes back, she not only remembers what was said and done that she downloaded for you as hurtful, she also feels the same emotion she felt back then. So replaying those movies is resentment. Forgiveness is simply letting go of resentment. In other words, I'm not going to replay those old videos in my head anymore. That is forgiveness. That's her job. That's her work. You can't fix the past. You can't move her to forgiveness, which is letting go of resentment, which is letting go of rehashing the old movies of what was said and done, and then feeling that old pain again. You are totally helpless. And this goes into the I can't control it filing cabinet. Now, if it's a past problem that's also a current problem, well, that's fair game. So if it's something that happened in the past that hurt her and you're still doing it, well, now you've got some work to do. But as far as going back, where are you going to find your time tunnel? If you could go back in time and erase the blackboard and start from a clean slate, well, we have a whole different conversation. Reality doesn't work like that. You're going to have to pick up from today and move forward. And you have to realize that it's going to take her a long time to let go of that resentment. And she may never get there. She may never get there. Whose problem is that? It's hers. It's not going to hurt you. When she's playing those old movies and replaying the hurt, you don't even know what's going on in her head. She is slowly destroying her own mental health. by replaying the movies. All of your wives need to be watching this movie here. So, well, what, Mark, am I just helpless? I can't do anything about fixing the past. That is correct. But, and this is a big but, you have some control about re-injuring from this point forward. You have the ability to not re-injure, and that is your job. Her job is letting go of resentment. Your job is making sure you're not doing anything from this point forward that she might resent. You're going to have to forgive yourself for making these relationship mistakes. That's a hard one to do. You're going to have to go, okay, well, I didn't know what I was dealing with. Yeah, I was an asshole, but sometimes, honestly, it was just a trait of the disorder, and I'm dodging paintballs all day and have high anxiety, so a lot of this stuff was, even though I'm not making excuses, it was definitely a part of autism. I know what I'm dealing with now, and so now that I have the label ASD level 1, I know what strengths and weaknesses come with that, and so now I have some really good ideas of where my work needs to begin. But I can't go back and fix the past, and I'm not going to beat up on myself about the fact that I can't fix the past. But by God, I can make sure I don't re-injure from this point forward. She wants this emotionality, for lack of a better term, from you, because she has felt perhaps that you're just a little too logical and robotic. When you try to problem solve, you're coming at it through the filter of almost entirely logic, almost. When she's trying to problem solve, especially when she's upset while she's trying to problem solve, she's almost coming purely through the emotional lens. That's why the two of you can't get anything resolved. But if he can move a little left of far right and be a little more emotional, and in an ideal world, she would contain some of that emotion in the heat of the moment and be more inclined to appeal to your logic. Now, instead of being in two separate pages, we're starting to merge at least somewhat on the same page. And that's when you can actually resolve some stuff. And then you get this snowball effect going in the other direction. Instead of a downward spiral, now you get an upward spiral. Because, hey, you know what? In the last 2 weeks, I've noticed that we have solved 2 major problems. That if those 2 things had come up last year, it would have just created a 3rd problem. But we actually resolved, or that talk that we had last night. I know for a fact if we'd had that talk last year, that would have ended in a shit show. We actually had a decent conversation, and we were civil with one another. And so now trust starts to come back. Feeling safe in the relationship starts to come back. Now both parties are more motivated to do even better. It's reinforcing. Okay, if I did a little bit good with that one, then I know I have it, and I can do a little bit better with that same thing next time, and a little bit better after that. And then pretty soon we're both getting really good at talking about heavyweight things or difficult things that would ordinarily end badly. We can talk about most of them now. It's never going to be perfect. We don't have to have it perfect. But our arguments are occurring less frequently, and even when they do occur, they're less intense. Now you're getting somewhere. One of the strengths, assuming he does have ASD level 1, that come with the package is he will tend to think critically. He has high expectancies in a very small number of interests. He is, and I could go into why this happens, but he's also very self-critical, usually because he was on the receiving end of a lot of unacceptance and disapproval growing up. He also tends to evaluate others based on his filter. The problem that it creates for you, though, is he can be very critical. He's self-critical. We mentioned that. But now, when you do something to yourself, you're in a much better position to do it to other people. So he can be very critical of you and intolerant of you. And it's very common for guys on the autism spectrum to be a little on the OCD side, the perfectionistic side. I'm not necessarily saying full-blown obsessive compulsive disorder, but most of them, at least in certain areas of life, are very perfectionistic. Another strength would be most of them have a very large vocabulary. usually within their field of interest, and they tend to have a very in-depth knowledge base, usually in one specific area. That's good. We wouldn't have the programmable computer right here if that hadn't happened. The problems that you run into based on that strength, though, is he will often use words to escape or avoid situations. He'll try to outlogicize you. I'm just making that term up. In his mind, he will view you as overly emotional and irrational, and you lose all credibility with him when you get emotional while you're trying to talk to him. The other thing that will happen based on the strengths of having a huge vocabulary and having a high IQ and having a lot of information in one area is that he will become easily and severely bored doing things outside of that area. And you may view him as someone who is very rigid and one-track mind and self-absorbed and a know-it-all, which is totally understandable. Another strength would be he can hyper-focus on his special interests for extended periods of time. Very intense concentration, long attention span in his area of interest. And he will be very goal-directed, very task-oriented, very persistent. Those are all good, except maybe with his significant other. The problems that you're going to run into and probably have based on those strengths is he's going to resist interruption. He's going to hate change, especially surprise change. He's going to forget or totally neglect some of the things that you want him to do. And he may even avoid you during his period of being hyper-focused on something over there. And you may view him as being very stubborn, and this would be understandable. Another strength would be he has a very inquisitive attitude, usually about the things in his special interest area or related. So it's very typical for, in this case, the guy with ASD level 1 to have a lot of intellectual curiosity. He will have intrinsic motivation. He won't really be motivated by outside forces. It's an internal thing. Sounds good, but the problems that arise is he may ask embarrassing questions. When you're trying to deliver a good message, you may feel like he's, instead of listening to you, he's just put you on the witness stand and interrogating you based on, what you're trying to say. You may view him as being someone who's resisting your input or your opinion or your perspective or your constructive criticism and so on. Another strength would be he is very autonomous. And he learned that again from childhood. I can't fit in with the team. I'm not a team player. I'm not good at socializing, and so I'm just going to go solo. And he's very independent and prefers individualized work and prefers work of a non-social nature, doesn't he? He's very reliant on self. Self-reliance, that's a great thing, isn't it? Well, some of the things that you may run into is he rejects your input. When you need him to be a team player, a lot of times he doesn't see the value in that. Another strength is he will tend to be high energy through the day. I'll just make up a scenario that'll help you wrap your brain around. He will be high energy at work. This is just one example of many. He will burn up so much energy at work that when he gets home, he has nothing left. So when when you use your mind, thinking and problem solving and working and reading and looking at facts, figures, objects, and that burns up a lot of energy. Your brain burns up a lot of energy when you're concentrating for extended periods of time, which he does very well. Only problem is he's burned up so much energy doing his special interests, in this example at work, he's got nothing left. He comes home and he's burnt out, and he has to do some version of de-escalation at that point. But with this business of having high energy, he will be very frustrated with inactivity. His mind is always racing. He would say if he were here, yeah, my mind is always racing and it has to be racing. Boredom is excruciating to me. And to just sit down and do nothing or engage in idle chit-chat with my wife is almost painful. It's because he needs constant stimulation, especially of a visual nature. Especially of a visual nature. And so you may view him as someone who's hyperactive and can never just sit down and relax and just be still and be quiet. Another strength is he enjoys organizing things in his head, and he may even enjoy organizing material things, and he probably at some level has tried to organize you to squeeze into his routine and structure. He is very good at systematizing. In other words, looking for patterns and themes and systems. Sounds like a good strength, but the problem is he may come off as being very bossy, rude, domineering. He may construct very complicated rules or systems of a social nature that don't match up with yours. He's going to have a lot of hidden rules in his head that he may not even be aware of at a conscious level, but if you violate any of those of his hidden rules, because he's big on rules, because he's big on structure, when you violate one of his rules, you'll know it. The last one is he has a great ability to conceptualize and to synthesize. He enjoys problem solving as long as it's not of a social or emotional nature, and he loves intellectual activity. Very high IQ, very high logic. Sounds like a great strength. Problem you run into, though, is he's going to omit some certain details that are important to you. He may reject some details that were important to you. He may question your instruction or your directives or your opinion or your perspective because it doesn't match up with his ability to conceptualize. Because you're assuming you're talking to him about something in the way of problem solving in the marriage, it's hard for him to look through the lens of emotions as you do well, which is a great skill for you. He's only looking through the lens of logic. So what I run into a lot in working with neurodiverse couples is this vacillation back and forth between two extremes. On one extreme, the individual engages in self-pity, but then will sometimes bounce to the other end of that continuum and engage in some version of self-loathing. And this is not gender specific. We'll use the NT wife and the ASD husband. They both do this from time to time. So we'll look at the self-pity end of the spectrum first. So usually the thought is something along the line of, I'm being mistreated, poor me, he needs to improve his behavior or she needs to improve her behavior. Now this thought results in the feeling of resentment, and then the behavior that results from this thought and this feeling is usually some form of retribution or revenge. And the behavior that's observable by the other party would be arguing, lecturing, threatening, coming from the individual who feels like they're being mistreated. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, we have self-loathing, and the thought that precipitates self-loathing is something along the line of, I mistreat my spouse. I engage in hurtful behavior. It's not the person I want to be. It's not the person I used to be. I've turned into a person that I don't really want to be, and I feel guilty about how I'm overreacting to my spouse. I may have thoughts along the lines of, I need to be punished. I'm being a bad person, and this will result in feelings of regret, guilt, shame. And then the desired outcome when the individual is in this particular frame of mind is to reduce that guilt and shame. And the behavior that results in this case is the individual tends to drive the other person away. They push their spouse away because they think they're not good enough for their spouse, and they're trying to protect their spouse by pushing them away. This individual in this frame of mind will also tend to not take care of himself or herself. He or she will engage in self-destructive behavior and possibly even have suicidal ideation. So again, on this spectrum here, we have two extremes. On one end, there's self-pity. Poor me, my spouse needs to change their behavior. Then, sometimes bouncing to the other end of the continuum, self-loathing, which is bad me, I need to be punished. But she does not have the ability to remove emotion from the equation. That's one of your strengths, is when you need to do some serious problem solving and analysis, you have the ability to pull emotions out of the equation. That's not always necessarily a great thing, but many, many times it is. Because as soon as you introduce subjectivity into solution hunting, you've made your work much more difficult. You put on your square wheels. But when you can remain objective, as you are in the business of solution hunting, and you've taken emotions out of the equation, you've smooth your path to where it's going to be straight and narrow, and you're going to get to that end result that you're searching for much more quickly. You're not going to get sidetracked with emotions. That's why she gets so annoyed with you, because she thinks you should be doing all those things that she can do. And it's worse than that. Not only does she think you're supposed to be able to be doing all these things, when you don't do them, she assigns something else to that behavior. Selfish, insensitive, rigid, uncaring, narcissistic, sociopathic. I'm not important. He doesn't care about me. He can't see my hurt, therefore he doesn't care about my hurt. No, just because I can't see your hurt, if I have emotions blindness, it doesn't mean I don't care about your hurt. So one of the things that's prominent in ASD is this business of problem with prediction. Another way of stating that is an inability to notice cause and effect, but I'm exclusively referring to social and emotional situations. The person with ASD can certainly predict things and understand cause and effect in the non-social arena, but has more difficulty when there are emotional and social nuances involved. And again, this is all in the context of social and emotional situations. When I say or do X, my spouse tends to feel Y. And when my spouse feels that particular way, I can do Z to help the situation. So we can see that that is the prediction there. My spouse will tend to feel a particular way based on my behavior, and the prediction there is what I can do that will likely help the situation. So what I say or do results in a particular feeling, and then when that particular feeling has manifest and I can do a form of a remedy, that's all cause and effect. Now sometimes it's not a direct cause, it's more of a correlation. In other words, A didn't necessarily cause B, but there was certainly a correlation. And this is all a result of the business of emotions blindness, which is alexithymia, and mind blindness. In a social and emotional situation, I can predict what the result is, and if I want to avoid that result in the future, I can say and do other things instead. So that business of prediction in the emotional social arena is difficult for people on the autism spectrum, which may explain why sometimes your ASD spouse seems very insensitive, uncaring, selfish, and perhaps even narcissistic. First of all, I don't want you to frame it as I'll never be normal, because you are normal for somebody who's on the autism spectrum. And there's no shame in having autism. Only about millions and millions of other people had it and have it. And there's way more strengths than challenges that come with this. You will have some strengths that a neurotypical male your age will not have. We wouldn't be on the programmable computer right now if it wasn't for somebody with Asperger's syndrome. So it's not that you're not normal, it's that you're not typical. Currently, the neurotypicals outnumber the autistics, but autism is on the rise, ASD level 1. So it's conceivable that at some point, people with ASD level 1 will outnumber the neurotypicals. So now the neurotypicals are not typical. So be careful with this. I know this is a tangential point. Be careful with this business of viewing yourself as not normal. No, you're just fine. And the reason that the NT wives have such difficulty accepting is because she's way up here with social and emotional intelligence. She's way up here with social and emotional skills. She's way up here with social and emotional needs. You're way up here with logic and general IQ. So she is up here high in SQ, which is social intelligence, EQ, which is emotional intelligence. You're way up here with logical intelligence and general IQ. But when you compare yourself to her, if you can see my hands here, if you compare yourself to her in the social and emotional intelligence department, you're way down here. I'm not saying you don't have emotions or don't have any social skills, but compared to her, you're way down here. ASD is a disorder where the social and emotional brain is underdeveloped. That's why they call it a developmental disorder. Doesn't mean you're dumb. You're probably smarter than me. Doesn't mean you don't have strengths. You got a ton of strengths.
She's highly intuitive, and she needs connection. You're not very intuitive at all, and you could go all year without talking about feelings. You could go all year without having some warm, fuzzy emotional connection with her. They don't understand, given their high level of social and emotional intelligence and intuition, this is their version of mind blindness. They can't wrap their brain around the idea that you're way down here. And they expect that you should be able to come up here and meet me at this level of emotional reciprocity. You should be able to do that. You could do better if you just put your mind to it. She's uneducated. Or she has educated herself on the traits of disorder, but is still in denial. Okay, cognitively I understand mind blindness, emotions blindness, executive function deficits, anxiety, sensory sensitivities, weak central coherence, problems with prediction. But I still think he could do better. Called denial, ladies. Denial. Resentment, very common. I talk about it all the time. The antidote is forgiveness. And forgiveness is this, and this only. I'm going to stop replaying this movie in my head. Or actually movies. Or another way of putting it, I'm going to stop recounting these events that have been so troublesome in the past. I'm going to no longer think about my past hurts. I'm not trying to sweep them under the rug. It did hurt. I have a right to be resentful, but my resentment is only hurting me. So I'm going to let go of resentment for my benefit, not for his. I'm going to stop reminding myself of all of these past events that were so hurtful for my benefit, not his. When you start to ruminate or replay the event, which you will, you don't beat up on yourself and go, and something you might be there might have been several minutes go by when you were contemplating and ruminating, I can't believe he said this, I can't believe he did this, why do I have to live like this? And then you go, oh, wait a minute, wait. There, I did it again. I was in the rabbit hole with my negative thoughts. You don't beat up on yourself about it. You go, well, I've practiced ruminating for years, so now and it's a habit. I'm going to have to develop a new habit of practicing that as soon as a thought comes in my head where I'm wanting to replay this movie, I'm instantly going to go, okay, wait a minute. We don't want to hash through that again because it's making me suffer. In theory, it's as easy as eating a piece of candy. But where it gets real difficult is you're going to have to catch yourself repeating the old habit and forgive yourself for doing that. Or I should say maybe don't beat up on yourself for relapsing. And you're going to have to be real consistent in practicing. It's going to take months. So that's the hard part, is retraining my mind to catch these negative thoughts. And okay, well, there was one. I don't know what popped in my head, but I just reminded me of this thing he said yesterday or last week. And I'm not going to finish that movie. I started the movie, and I used to sit there for the entire thing. Now the movie starts, I'm leaving the theater instantly. And then you distract yourself, you move on to whatever you're doing. This will happen a dozen times a day. I would ask you to stop with the thoughts of, well, he can't help it. This is part of the disorder. I'd rather you have that thought than to not have that thought. But whenever you have that thought, well, it's not his fault. He has this disorder, and this is just what I'm going to have to live with. You're feeding your resentment again. Don't try to make sense of it. Just that when you would ordinarily have the thought, oh, here it goes again, blah, he can't help it. Oh, wait a minute. That's playing the movie again. I'm not going to try to make sense of it. I'm not going to try to explain it away. I'm not going to try to get him off the hook and just chalk it up to, no, I'm not doing I'm not playing this game anymore. I'm out. Catch yourself thinking about him and shift.
So it's not uncommon for people on the autism spectrum to have mood swings and sometimes some very severe mood swings. So with mood swings, you may have a severely distorted self-image. You may feel worthless and fundamentally flawed at some level. Also, anger, impulsiveness, and frequent anxiety can push others away. In other words, you kind of inadvertently keep people at arm's length, even though you may desire to have loving and lasting relationships. Many people have some degree of moodiness, but they get better with treatment, and they can live very satisfying lives. So don't get moody about being moody. Mood swings affect how you feel about yourself and how you relate to others and how you behave. So if you are aware that you engage in destructive behavior but feel unable to change it, or if you have difficulty controlling emotions or impulses, maybe you fear being around crowds, you feel misunderstood, you feel neglected, or sometimes you feel empty or hopeless. Maybe you have some sense of self-hate or self-loathing, and you might find that on occasion you even have suicidal thoughts. Then these are the signs of excessive moodiness that fall outside the normal range that we all have and would suggest that you might want to get some treatment. So when people on the autism spectrum have severe mood swings, they often have an insecure sense of who they are. Their self-image or their self-identity often changes rapidly, and they may even view themselves as bad or there's something wrong with me, and sometimes they feel as if they don't exist at all, or they're on the wrong planet. And unfortunately, an unstable self-image not only leads to mood swings, but it can lead to frequent changes in jobs, friendships, goals, values, just to name a few. So when the person on the autism spectrum has frequent and severe mood swings, obviously their relationships are usually in turmoil, and it seems like there is always conflict. If this sounds like something you're going through, you may find that you idealize your spouse one moment and then quickly shift to anger and resentment or perceived slights at other moments. This is because you may have difficulty accepting gray areas. In other words, you see things either in terms of exclusively black or white. So the treatment for mood swings includes psychotherapy and sometimes medications. The method I use would probably be subsumed under the category of cognitive behavioral therapy, and this is where I help the individual become aware of inaccurate, negative, and ineffective thinking patterns, faulty belief patterns, cognitive distortions, and get to the point where they can view challenging social situations and challenging emotional situations more clearly and objectively, looking through a different lens. We would look at your faulty belief systems that contribute to cognitive distortions, that contribute to uncomfortable emotions, that contribute to destructive behavior.
You know, a lot of the focus sometimes, especially in some Facebook groups, and unfortunately I have some, where the focus is all on the negative stuff. I'm not saying we should overlook the negative or minimize the negative, but there's always more positive, even with, in this case, the ASD husband there, than there is negative, although most of the positive stuff that lies within him, most of the strengths that he has, are not necessarily revealed in the context of the marriage. So he does have a lot of skills, but as far as skills that would be in the social and emotional realm of things, which are the skills that really count for you, now they're kind of sparse. But some of the things that he might have in the way of strengths that may or may not fall within the emotional reciprocity, give and take in conversation, and so on department, he's going to be very good at attending to details, sometimes with painstaking perfection, sometimes hyper-focusing on one detail to the exclusion of others, which that's not necessarily positive, but that could happen with the overly logical brain. He's going to have most likely an excellent rote memory. He has to rely on rote memory because in many cases that's the only way he can remember effectively. He has to learn by example. He's not going to be able to generalize from one example to the next. So you may have tried to correct him on something and you got the impression that he got it, and then something else happened that was almost the identical thing, but he didn't get it. And it's like, wait a minute, how could you not get that? Because the other thing that we talked about was almost the same thing. So it's good that he has rote memory, but the downside to that is he's not going to be able to generalize. He'll have to learn everything piece by piece, and he won't be able to take what he learned from situation one and apply it to situation two. He's going to have higher fluid intelligence. In fact, there's a lot of research that suggests that people with ASD level 1 we're talking about have, on average, higher fluid intelligence than NTs. And if you want to know what that is, it's the ability to find meaning in confusion and to solve new problems. But we're not talking about in the social and emotional realm of things. We're talking about science, engineering, computer programming, and so on. Another characteristic of high fluid intelligence is the ability to draw inferences and to understand the relationships of various concepts independent of acquired knowledge. Independent of acquired knowledge. So that is I would want to call it their ability to be intuitive in the cognitive sense, not so much in the emotional sense. He's going to be very gifted in one area, maybe two. Sometimes he has several interests. He usually has one special interest, and he's pretty much an expert in that area, whatever it is. He is a very independent and unique thinker. He probably spends a lot of time alone in his head. I call it getting lost in his internal world. And he has developed his own unique thoughts as opposed to a herd mentality. And he has a set of rules in his head, and you won't know what they are unless you violate them. And he is very much a solo player, independent, autonomous. That's not altogether good, especially in the context of a marriage. He has internal motivation, we will call it, as opposed to being motivated by outside things like praise, money, acceptance from others, and so on. He's going to be very logical, but on the not so great side, it's always going to be logic over emotion. So it's great to have high LQ, logical intelligence. But if you don't weave in some EQ, which you're good at, emotional intelligence, depending on what the situation needs, it's very lopsided. He's going to be great at systematizing. In other words, thinking in systems and seeing patterns and themes and viewing, and again, this would have nothing to do in the social and emotional realm of things. But when it comes to facts, figures, objects, graphs, sciencey things, engineering, computer programming, he can make sense out of stuff that would blow your mind. He could look at something, let's use calculus as the example, and he would blow through that almost at a genius level, perhaps. I'm kind of making up an exaggerated example. And you would look at that same thing and go, I have no idea what the hell that even is. But he sure figured it out pretty fast. So he's going to be a very visual three-dimensional thinker. Those are some of the positives. And I wanted to start off with that just so you don't think that he's got nothing going for him. He doesn't have much going for him with respect to the social and emotional intricacies that you would like to see, because he is in his own little world a lot. He definitely will have some obsessive thinking patterns. He's going to have difficulty understanding others' feelings, especially yours. He might come off as eccentric and narcissistic. It doesn't mean he's narcissistic, just some of the traits of the disorder look like narcissism. You've probably run into him disliking and perhaps even hating chit-chat, small talk, especially of topics that fall outside of his special interest. It may appear that he lacks empathy at times. He does have empathy, but he does lack displayed empathy. And since you don't see it, you assume that it's not there. He's not going to have much interest in other people in general, like you do. He's going to come off as being very rigid and dogmatic because he has so much uncertainty going on in his world that he has to create as much certainty and predictability as possible, and that manifests in behavior that looks very rigid and controlling. He's going to have very limited interests, and most anything that you would want him to do, most anything, if not damn near everything, will fall outside of his special interest. He will not have much desire or motivation to do some of those things. His attention is going to be narrowly focused. He's going to be preoccupied with his own agenda. He may shut down whenever he is made to work on something at a level that he can't work on in the social and emotional sense. There's a lot of stuff that goes on in the trait department that really makes your job very difficult. You're going to have to adjust your expectations. if you're going to stay in this marriage and you want to avoid mental illness or physical illness, you will have to adjust your expectations. Period.
So if you feel like you just have to vent sometimes in order to get some frustration out, that's fine. I would have to say there is a time and place for that, but just know that if you're going to vent, you're not going to be able to problem solve at the same time. Those two are mutually exclusive. So you want to vent, but you've thrown away the opportunity to problem solve, and it's a little bit worse than that. You've also greatly decreased the likelihood of ever solving that problem in question, especially with chronic venting. So you pick which one you're going to do. It's going to be one or the other. It's never going to be both. And for those of you that think, well, if I just complain loud enough and long enough, I'll get my spouse to change their behavior. No.
Let's imagine that you got shipwrecked on a remote island, and it was just you and this other lady. And she speaks Chinese and you speak Russian, okay? And neither one of you know the other language, but you know enough of how Chinese sounds that you know she's speaking Chinese, you just not sure what she's saying. She knows enough about how Russian sounds that she knows you're speaking Russian, but she doesn't understand what you're saying. What would you do in that situation? Probably would be using some version of rudimentary sign language. You would be pointing to things, and you would be using your particular language as you're pointing to things or whatever. So there would be a huge visual component. And also, as both parties are kind of pointing and demonstrating physically with their arms and whatnot, they're speaking their language, and so the other person kind of gets some idea of what a particular word is based on what you're pointing to or whatever. For example, let's say that you can see over in the distance that there's a thunderstorm coming, really super dark clouds and lightning, and you look to this lady that speaks Chinese and you point, and you're talking and demonstrating, see, thunder, lightning, you and me probably need to find cover over there. And so you're speaking Russian as you're using sign language, so to speak, and she kind of gets it. So the whole point to this is, I'm going to make up a term, logic. I'm going to call it logic-ease. She operates mostly through the emotional lens. We're going to call it emotion-ease. You're stuck with somebody who speaks almost only emotion-ease, and you're a person who speaks almost only logic-ease. And so the two of you are not speaking the same language, and she doesn't get you. She expects you to get her, doesn't she? You're supposed to know what I want. You're supposed to know how to behave. You're supposed to know what I'm feeling and why. You're supposed to be able to read my mind and my emotions. I know I'm being sarcastic, but not much. She doesn't get you either. She doesn't get your logic. She doesn't get your why you think the way you do, why you feel the way you do, why you behave the way you do, why you have certain opinions. The moral to the story is this. That's why a long way around the bush to get to this point. One of the things that you can do if you're so inclined, and you have compassion, you have empathy, don't let anybody tell you otherwise, you can think in terms of, okay, I'm with a lady that speaks emotionese, and she has very little clue about me and how I operate. And so instead of getting upset with her like she has done with me, how many times? Lost count. I'm going to muster up a little grace and mercy, compassion, patience in that moment and realize she just doesn't speak my language. And I'm going to work really hard at not getting angry with her for not speaking my language. She's stuck in the language of emotionese. She's stuck there. She can't crawl out of her skin and crawl into your skin and look out of your eyeballs and use your brain. She doesn't have much of a clue about you, and she will never have much of a clue about you. And that's not necessarily her fault, because you don't understand her either a lot of the time. Some things you do, of course. But there has been times where you think, God, she's so overly emotional and irrational, and why would she feel that way, and why would she want us to do that? So it's confusion, two-way street. It's a two-way street. And so the point is, again, in those moments where you're so frustrated with her And especially when when you're downloading her words and behavior as she's belittling you and being critical of you, try, guys, in those moments to be thinking, okay, here we go. Just like the Chinese and Russian people on the island, she's speaking Emotionese, I'm speaking Russian. We're not going to have a meeting of the minds much here. We're very rarely on the same page. And so instead of me getting aggravated that she's not speaking my language, I'm just going to have some grace and mercy in that moment and realize she's speaking Emotionese. She doesn't get me. Not going to allow myself to get bent out of shape given the dynamics here. When next time you're frustrated with your wife, look at her as a foreigner and who doesn't get you. And I think if you will do that, she won't push your buttons as bad. We want to think in terms of grace and mercy. That's the big message here. She's downloading things a particular way. You're not causing her download. You're not responsible for how she's downloading things. She's choosing her download, and then she is feeling based on the download a particular way, and she's saying and behaving particular ways based on how she feels. So I'm going to have a little grace and mercy and realize I don't have any control over that. It's a shame that she is so miserable. I'm going to take the high road here and realize, I would hate to be her, where I'm always suffering so much in this way. So instead of me getting defensive or trying to explain myself or trying to go head to head with her or feeling criticized, instead I'm going to choose grace and mercy. This is for your benefit, grace and mercy. Grace and mercy, that's your new mantra, grace and mercy. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to extend a little mercy in this situation when she gets done talking, which is I'm going to avoid getting defensive and getting angry back and explaining and then ridiculing her. So that's what she's doing to me right now. I'm listening to it as I see her, and I'm not going to do the same thing to her. That's mercy in the moment. Mercy in the moment. You're going to realize I don't need to be taking this behavior as personally like she's been doing. She has taken my autistic traits personally. She's so locked into the emotional brain that it's hard for her to muster up logic. Not that she doesn't have any logic, but she basically, when she's upset, she doesn't have any logic. And so she has her own mind blindness too. That's how she's wired. And I'm not going to take it personally anymore. She can't help her wiring any more than I can help my wiring. So I'm not going to participate in this game of who should change their wiring first. It's not going to happen. She's not going to change mine. I can't change her. I give up. I'm no longer going to try to explain or correct her or get her to understand my perspective. I have no control over it. Grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. She cannot wrap her brain around the belief systems that you have, the way that you think, the way that you feel, or the fact that you lack displayed emotion, the way that you behave, your logic. She doesn't get it. That's the NT version of mind blindness. You're doing things that she is downloading as inappropriate, and that's what's causing the pain. In those meltdownish moments, it's your brain that's high speed. And in those meltdownish moments, you will not be able to calm your brain down unless you calm your body down first. So when you're trying to de-escalate so that you can come back and engage in the conversation again in a calm fashion, you will have to slow your body down, and only then will your mind slow down. When you're de-escalating, don't go somewhere and get busy. Go somewhere and go for a slow walk, do some deep breathing, meditate, do that. Do something that's going to slow your body down, because then and only then will your mind slow down. Meltdownish moments, mind will not be able to slow itself down. We're talking about the NT wife and the ASD husband in this group. And so I want to talk briefly about when you guys are trying to problem solve a relationship issue. She will tend to look largely through the lens of emotion, which that's how she's wired. There's nothing wrong with that. He will tend to look through the lens of logic mostly when he's trying to figure things out and problem solve. That's the way he's wired. Nothing wrong with that. I do want to argue against trying to be logical when both parties are somewhat upset, and certainly when they're majorly upset, because it's not going to work. So sometimes the advice to be logical, let's be rational. That's impossible until you wind down. It doesn't work to try to be rational in the heat of the moment, trying to sort through and analyze the relationship difficulties and trying to stay logical. Well, I can promise you it hasn't worked. And the most logical thing to do is when you're overwhelmed, just allow yourself to feel whatever it is that you feel, and don't try to brainstorm your way out of it. Don't be logical in those moments. If you try to be logical, how you feel will kind of be the premise for your logical argument. And how you feel in that moment is not representative of how the relationship goes in its entirety. You then logically take those feelings and reach conclusions, right? You take your uncomfortable emotions and try to reach conclusions when you're trying to be logical. And that's not the kind of emotion-free reasoning that I'm suggesting. So instead, make the logical choice to not try logic when you're emotionally overwhelmed. Instead, let yourself feel what it is, let time pass. When you're cool-headed again, then the two of you can and should try to remove emotions from the equation, mostly, not entirely. That would be impossible. You do need, and I'm talking about the neurodiverse couples here, as much as this might be a turnoff to the NT wife, when you come back and everybody's calmed down, you're going to have to treat it like a business meeting. If you want to get it anywhere with him, you're going to have to pretend like he's a coworker and that you are in the boardroom and now going to conduct a business meeting. Using faulty emotional logic would only serve to strengthen your belief in your irrational views. When you're calm and you want to problem solve, let's shoot for 80% logic, 20% feelings. And in an ideal world, you wouldn't try to problem solve when you're upset anyway, because now both people are by default, especially him if he's bordering on a meltdown, totally irrational. And they'll come up with some ideas to problem solve, which they think are rational, but they're totally irrational and they're laden with emotional background. Both parties have flashed back because at this point, you've argued for how many years? 5, 10, 15, 20, 30. And so each argument weighs more than the ones that you had 10 years ago, because each argument, there's a cumulative effect. Even though the argument technically might be on a scale of 1 to 10 of 4 level of severity, it feels like a 9 because it's on the back of all the other arguments that didn't get resolved. Emotional intelligence has 5 skills. It's the ability to connect with others through nonverbal communication. It's the ability to quickly reduce stress. It's the ability to recognize and manage your emotions. It's the ability to resolve conflict positively. And it's the ability to use humor and play when you're dealing with serious relationship challenges. How good is he in any of those? In the emotional intelligence department, if you were his teacher and you were giving him a grade, would he get a big fat F- on his emotional skills? Mm-hmm. And you want to label it what? What do you want to label it? What have you labeled it? You can multitask cognitively. He cannot. So if you bring up problem 1 and then 30 minutes into the conversation, which is way too long, you're now on problem 5 or 6, you lost him way back there at the 5-minute mark. And so you're just wasting your time and energy and oxygen at that point because he's not getting it. He might sit there and look like he's getting it. So it would be best to tackle one issue at a time. If the second issue comes up, just maybe catch it and go, okay, well, really, that's probably a slightly different issue. I'll broach that later. A lot of the NTYs run into the trap of thinking that no, this is not a separate topic. It ties into that one. No, I don't want anything that ties into that one. You have no problem seeing the big picture. He has a big problem seeing the big picture, And you will go on to a second point and you think it's the same point. No, it's not to him. He does not think globally like that. He does not have the ability to generalize and see the big picture. So you have to stay very tight on that one topic. And it can't be 1A, 1B, and 1C. That won't work. You can do that, and you do it well. That's one of your strengths. He ain't got that strength.
Okay, so a few important points for the neurotypical individuals out there that are just now beginning a relationship with someone on the autism spectrum. You can view ASD level 1 as a disorder of insight into the thoughts and feelings of others. It's just about that simple. Let me repeat that. Think of ASD as a disorder of insight into the thoughts and feelings of others. If you'll keep that in mind, a lot of stuff will make sense as you progress through the development of this relationship with someone on the autism spectrum. Also, know that it's going to be hard for you to understand your ASD spouse's needs. He may be interested in things that seem very boring to you, and he may find seemingly normal social situations very stressful. Also, remember that he may not be able to read all the social cues that you understand without even trying. Also, keep in mind that getting very upset with him because he's not as intuitive as you is probably not going to be the best way to get through to him. Also, understand that all the unwritten rules of behavior are going to be very confusing to him. Something that you think is obvious is not going to be obvious to your ASD spouse. ASD individuals may not be able to project their mind into hypothetical situations or put themselves in someone else's shoes. They may not immediately recognize your needs. That doesn't mean they're being insensitive, uncaring, selfish, narcissistic, and so on. It's called mind blindness. And also your ASD spouse or partner may have a lack of perception about your motives. But bear in mind that this is largely due to mind blindness issues rather than blatant selfishness or narcissism. Lastly, understand that in some cases the ASD partner or spouse is simply not going to get better or be transformed into the husband you thought you married. Even so, certain behavior can be modified or changed, which can make daily life less stressful for you and him. And counseling can help big time, but it has to be somebody who has some expertise in ASD. Don't go to a neurotypical counselor because he or she is not going to factor in mind blindness, emotions blindness, executive function deficits, sensory sensitivities, weak central coherence, problems with prediction, and so on. So you need to find somebody who understands the neurodiverse marriage that will help you establish routines and agreeable timetables and will go into a deep dive of how to talk to one another and what kind of language needs to be used.
Your ASD spouse's 7 love languages. Number 1, no interruptions. Don't talk to me until I'm done doing what I'm doing. Number 2, no long conversations. Your monologues fall way outside of my special interests. Number 3, no vague messages. I'm not as intuitive as you. Number 4, no displays of emotions when talking. Your negative emotions stress me out. Number 5, no feelings talk. Just tell me what you need. Number 6, no throwing up the past. If I can't fix it, I don't want to hear about it. And number 7, no data dumping. Don't wander into numerous other problems before we resolve the current one. If you'll do these 7 love languages, your ASD spouse will love you for it.
Do you ever get tired of looking at all the negative things associated with your ASD spouse? Here are just a few of the abilities associated with ASD level 1, or Asperger's syndrome. Visual, 3-dimensional thinking. Most people on the autism spectrum are very visual in their thought processes, which lends itself to countless useful and creative applications. Logic over emotion. Although people with ASD are very emotional at times, they spend so much time computing in their minds that they get quite good at it, and they can be very logical in their approach to problem solving. Internal motivation. They're motivated internally as opposed to being motivated by praise, money, bills, or acceptance, which ensures a job done with conscience and with personal pride. Independent, unique thinking. People on the autism spectrum tend to spend a lot of time alone and will likely have developed their own unique thoughts as opposed to a herd mentality. High IQ. Many experts say that those with ASD often have a higher than average general IQ. Higher fluid intelligence. Scientists have discovered that people with ASD level 1 have a higher fluid intelligence than neurotypicals, which is the ability to find meaning in confusion and solve new problems and draw inferences and understand the relationships of various concepts independent of acquired knowledge. Focus and diligence. This is the autistic person's ability to focus on tasks for a long period of time without needing supervision or incentive. Attention to detail, sometimes with painstaking perfection. So people on the spectrum are a varied group of people who are mostly bright, funny, articulate, caring, logical, honest, and persistent, and who just happen to think and behave a bit differently.
Hey guys, this is Mark, and I got a quick message to the neurotypical spouses out there. We'll use the example of the NT wife and the ASD husband. There's been many times where you tried to get him on board with something that was important to you, and you tried to appeal to his empathy by talking about your feelings, and you didn't get anywhere, did you? So instead of trying to appeal to his empathy by talking about feelings, it would be best to try to appeal to his logic and present your facts. So if you are in a situation where you're trying to get your autistic husband to find the importance of an issue that you have, you're going to have to appeal to his logic. So in all discussions with your ASD husband about a situation, there will be two aspects. One, the selling of an idea, which is your part, and two, the buying of an idea, which is your husband's part. Both parts must always be considered together. The best sales pitch is incomplete if the new idea is not accepted or bought. This process requires constant monitoring of progress by the salesperson, which is you, who should look and ask for feedback from the buyer, which is him, regarding this step-by-step approach. A cardinal rule is to never move ahead to the next step without checking to see if the buyer, which again is your husband, is moving with you. If he's not, repeat the last step in another way. For your ASD spouse, this means that you need to convince him that there's a better way to look at and react to a situation than what he has shown you. He needs to hear what you are saying, maybe even see it, and then accept it if a better behavior is to occur. But you need to realize that new thinking can't occur easily because your ASD spouse is not a blank slate. He already has a competitive version of your idea. Let me repeat that. He already has a competitive version of your idea. Different stories and interpretations are present in him that will compete with your new story or mindset. If the new mindset or thinking is to succeed, it must replace, suppress, complement, or outweigh every other story or competing version or idea that he has. And only the most powerful argument will win. Now, your prior history with your ASD spouse is a very powerful force in this equation. All previous unproductive discussions and interpretations that you've had with him will make your job that much harder and must be replaced as well. To deal with these factors, you must be persistent, stick to the point, not allow irrelevant items to be brought into the conversation, and finally, provide the reasons for new thinking. So there you go. In summary, if you want your autistic husband to cooperate with you on something, instead of trying to appeal to his emotions by talking about your emotions, you need to talk to him in a logical sense because that's how he's wired, and you need to do a great sales job. So in working with adults on the autism spectrum over the years, I've noticed a prominent theme, and I'm just going to refer to it as the anxiety, meltdown, guilt, self-punishment theme. And this is a cycle that many adults with Asperger's, ASD level 1, high-functioning autism, whatever we're calling it nowadays, they've experienced this in many cases since childhood. So in a nutshell, the cycle starts with anxiety, which in turn leads to a meltdown, which then leads to the individual feeling guilty for acting out his anxiety in the form of anger or rage, and then this ends up with the person punishing himself due to repeated relationship failures that result from this destructive cycle. So let's look at each of those points. And anxiety was the first step in this cycle. So unfortunately, it's very common for people on the autism spectrum to experience more than their fair share of anxiety, and to make matters worse, they're not really sure how to manage their anxiety. So people on the spectrum are particularly prone to anxiety disorders in general as a consequence of the social demands made on them. In many cases, any social contact can generate anxiety as to how to start, maintain, and end the activity or conversation. And changes to daily routine can exacerbate anxiety, as can sensory sensitivities. Many of my clients have reported feeling anxious for no apparent reason at all. And some of them tend to take life too seriously, take others' behavior and comments too personally, and generally consider themselves to be somewhat of a worrywart. In other words, they're chronically worrying that something bad will happen, or that they won't meet certain expectations, they won't be able to make their spouse happy, it doesn't matter what they say or do, it's never good enough, and so on. So they're chronically worrying, and if they're not worrying about family life, maybe they're worrying about work life. So there's the anxiety piece in this anxiety, meltdown, guilt, self-punishment cycle. The second piece of the puzzle here was the meltdown. So as anxiety, whatever its cause, builds up and builds up and builds up, eventually the dam breaks, so to speak, usually over something very small. It's the straw that breaks the camel's back. This is called a meltdown. Under severe enough stress, any normally calm and collected individual may become out of control, even to the point of being verbally abusive. That's true. But autistic individuals experience repeated meltdowns in which tension mounts until there is an explosive release. And the meltdown's not always directed at others. Sometimes it's directed toward the self. In other words, self-injury, and in worst case scenarios, of course, suicide. Adults with ASD level 1 who experience meltdowns are often perceived by others as always being angry. Rage may be a common reaction experienced when coming to terms with problems in employment, relationships, friendships, and other areas of life affected by autism spectrum disorders. And there is often an on-off quality to this rage, where the person may be calm minutes later after a meltdown, while people around the person that just melted down are stunned for hours, if not days. Neurotypical spouses often struggle to understand these meltdowns, with resentment and bitterness often building up over time, which is totally understandable. And in some cases, the individual on the autism spectrum may not acknowledge he has trouble with rage and will blame others for provoking him. Of course, there's going to be hundreds of examples of how meltdowns can play out, but for the sake of this discussion here, let's use the following example. Let's say that you had a rough day at work, you maybe masked all day, you kept yourself composed, you stuffed your emotion just to make it through, you maintained your composure, but it took a lot of work to get that done, and it was exhausting. So you get home, and at an unconscious level perhaps, you take it out on your wife. Let's say your neurotypical wife makes a comment that hits you wrong for some reason, and then you explode. So in other words, you kind of take out your stressful day on your wife unintentionally perhaps. And that is the straw that broke the camel's back. Now we get to the next phase of this cycle, which is the guilt phase. Using this particular scenario that I just described, if that scenario plays itself out numerous times over several years, the person on the autism spectrum may come to believe that he's a victim of his emotions. In this case, work-related stress expressed in the form of misplaced anger toward his wife and perhaps other family members. But not only does he feel like a victim of circumstances, he also feels an element of guilt and remorse for hurting the people that he knows he's supposed to love. And he may have tried numerous times to avoid repeating this scenario, but to no avail, because he still has work-related stress, still hasn't figured out a way to deal with the stress at work in a functional, non-destructive way, and still carries that stress home with him when he walks through the front door. Now we're at the fourth and final step of this cycle, which is self-punishment. So as a result of repeated social failures, in our example, it would be numerous negative encounters with his wife, the individual on the spectrum may come to the conclusion that he doesn't deserve love, doesn't deserve compassion, doesn't deserve a peaceful lifestyle in general. So then he may do destructive things to punish himself. For example, he might beat upon himself with negative self-talk, drinking, drug use, overeating, isolation, and possibly separation or divorce. Self-punishment is a dysfunctional method for reducing feelings of guilt. Now, guilt is supposed to be a pro-social emotion. In other words, it functions to preserve important relationships. But many people on the autism spectrum who experience repeated exposures to this cycle that I'm describing have unresolved guilt, which prevents them from enjoying life and thriving emotionally. Now, self-punishment tends to serve a dual purpose. One, it relieves internal feelings of guilt, and two, it impacts how others perceive us. So by engaging in self-punishment or costly apologies, the autistic individual demonstrates that he's willing to harm himself in some way to even the score, so to speak, with those he has wronged, therefore restoring his reputation as a fair person. Now there is a fifth and final step, which is just anxiety again. So we've gone from anxiety to meltdown to guilt to self-punishment, full circle back to anxiety again. This cycle can feel like being stuck in a perpetual nightmare if it continues on long enough. Months or even years of experiencing a bunch of negative emotions, stress, frustration, anger, rage, guilt, etc., can make relationships so problematic that in some cases the better option becomes living alone and perhaps even avoiding human contact as much as possible. But here's why this causes anxiety. Because even people on the autism spectrum are social creatures by nature. Therefore, living a life of solitude carries its own element of anxiety, because people need other people. So if you get so frustrated with life and with yourself that you just get divorced and you just try to avoid people as much as possible, you have laid your own trap. Because, again, you're a social creature by nature. You need people whether you want them in your life or not. And when you avoid people, when you go to great lengths to avoid people, you are creating additional anxiety. You're not removing anxiety.
So there are 6 main reasons why people with ASD have such high anxiety. Number 1, limitations in generalizing from one situation to another often contributes to repeating the same social gaffes. Number 2, limitations in their ability to grasp social cues and their highly rigid style act in concert to create repeated social errors. Number 3, many experience the discomfort that comes from somatic or bodily responses that are disconnected from events and experience. Number 4, the lack of empathy severely limits skills for autonomous social problem solving. Number 5, the social challenges of ASD make it difficult for people with the disorder to develop coping strategies for soothing themselves and containing difficult emotions. And number 6, there is sufficient grasp of situations to recognize that others get it when they do not.